My name is John Adams. I'm going to lead the tour today, but I'm hoping to get as much information from you as possible, and I know that's really the purpose of today as well, as part of an information gathering session. So never know how many people to expect in the rain, but thanks for coming. And it's really just beginning for me because it's a big neighborhood, lots of information as I'm discovering, and hopefully you can provide a little bit more, and I will do a little bit more as well. So I will include this as part of my winter history tour program as well. This is a useful place to gather because it's identifiable and we can stop and get a coffee, but we're going to be working our way through the community, zigging and zagging, over to Christie's Carriage House. But this is a good place because it gives us one of the boundaries of the neighborhood. The neighborhood, of course, gets its name from the hospital across the street, south of the Jubilee Hospital, but it's the streets, Cadbury Bay Road and Oak Bay Avenue, that really help define the neighborhood as well in terms of boundaries and major routes to get here. So just like to explain a little bit about the background. Cadbury Bay Road started downtown and it went to Cadbury Bay. So the early roads were named after the place they went to. So Oak Bay Avenue went, not because of the municipality of Oak Bay, it went to Oak Bay, the bay. And Foul Bay Road went originally to Foul Bay Road. The early name for Fairfield Road was Foul Bay Road because it went to Foul Bay. So Cadbury Bay Road went to Cadbury Bay. There was a native village there when Fort Victoria was built in 1843. And the Hudson's Bay Company established a farm called Uplands Farm where they raised cattle. And that's why Cattle Point is named Cattle Point. Later on in 1849, John Todd came down from Kamloops and established a farm at what is now Willows. He owned most of the area between Willows Beach, just this side of Uplands, all the way through where Estevan Village is, and much of the area just over here on the west side of Cadbury Bay Road. Not a very productive farm, but he built a house, very first house built in that area, 1850. There were other farms as well in the area, and it became a very popular place. Cadbury Bay is a nice warm beach for swimming, it's sandy, and so with the gold rush of 1858 and people arriving in town, they would head out on Cadbury Bay Road, winding in and out to get to Cadbury Bay. And a very smart man in 1864 decided he was going to capitalize on this by building a saloon. And the saloon was called the Hotel Willows, and it stood just down that way, just across the street from where the high school is now. And it stood there for years and years, sometimes being prosperous, much of the time not. Later it became a boys' school. So it was about halfway between town and Cadbury Bay. But there was lots more. In the 1880s, the BC Agricultural Society built a huge exhibition building in what is now Beacon Hill Park. And some local people didn't like that, went to court. Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie ruled that it couldn't be there, and so the Agricultural Society and the City of Victoria bought a huge tract of land just out here. It wasn't Oak Bay. Oak Bay didn't exist as a separate municipality. It was just over there. A huge exhibition building, other agricultural buildings, a racetrack. This was known as the driving park, and everybody would come out here on weekends. Later there was an airport. In World War I, the military camped there before they went to Europe, and you'd see them marching down Cadbury Bay Road. So it was a busy place. People were passing by. They weren't living here. They were simply passing by from town, heading out that way. In 1890-91, the streetcar system started in Victoria, and one of the early lines headed out right along Cadbury Bay Road, and it finished at, guess where? The hotel, which was the entrance to the fairgrounds as well. And wherever the streetcars went, the area began to develop. And this neighborhood was one of the best served by streetcars in all of Victoria because there was another streetcar line in 1890 that ran right along what is now Oak Bay Avenue. So people were served within 2 blocks of wherever they lived by excellent streetcar service out that way or down into town. That's one of the reasons that this neighborhood began to develop after the 1890s. And something else that probably drove the people here crazy and packed the streetcars, the arena. Victoria has just built a new arena, but the first arena in town was the Patrick Brothers private arena, a huge wood structure in 1911. They had the first game at Christmas time, 1911, and the building burned down later on, but it stood also right across the street from the high school. there's a small plaque there now. So this neighborhood was really quite an amazing place in terms of people passing back and forth. But it was the Jubilee Hospital which originally started to give it some identity. So having set the scene, I'd like to take us down to the corner of Lee, and we'll stop there next. So if everybody's here, let's head this way. Where the hospital is now originally had been one of the slaughterhouses in Victoria. Out in the country, of course, they brought the cattle in some cases by ship from down in Puget Sound. Sometimes they were up at Uplands Farm, but they were sometimes brought in as well, dropped off into the water at Cattle Point. There was a big holding pen down at the parking lot below Fort Street. They were held there until there were enough to drive through town to the slaughterhouse. Emily Carr writes about having got in the way of one of these cattle drives when she was a girl in the early 1870s on Fort Street, bellowing cattle, big horns rampaging through the street with the cowboys running behind them, and somebody grabbed her and pulled her into a saloon so that she wouldn't be trampled by these stampeding cattle. And where were they going? Well, some of them were heading to the slaughterhouse that was just out this way. Why they chose this site for the hospital, I don't know, because when they did in 1887, it was way out in the country. And, of course, people grumble sometimes about having to drive out to Helmken Road if they're having a baby, but imagine, in days before streetcars, because this was the 1880s, in days before most people had horses and buggies, how are you going to get out here? It was probably a very interesting proposition at the time, but it was out in the country. The land was cheap, which was probably the most important thing, and it was out in the country where the beautiful country air would help make people better. And so the hospital was here, and of course in those days there were lots of contagious diseases, so the isolation hospital was part of it. People that were suffering from very contagious diseases like smallpox would be isolated in places like that. There were earlier hospitals in Victoria, St. Joseph's for one, but also other public hospitals, the female infirmary, where the Christian Science Church is now, the head of Pandora, and also the earlier Royal Hospital. However, they merged to form the Royal Jubilee in Queen Victoria's Jubilee year in 1887. And so the buildings that we know today across the street began at that time. But it must have been like going to the ends of the earth for most people. That was one of the reasons why, when the streetcars came in 1890, one of the first lines ran right up what was then called Mount Ptolemy Avenue, what is now Richmond Road, to bring people out from town to the hospital. Now, where we are right now is something rather intriguing, and this is the sort of thing that always makes me take a double take when I'm in a neighborhood. I look for the old bits and pieces that indicate that there was something here before. Now, apartments from, well, the 1940s and later, but this stone wall seems to have been here a lot earlier. And people didn't build stone walls when they were building apartment buildings. They were knocking them down, in fact. But this one remains. And it turns out that Lee Avenue gets its name from the Lee family who lived here. Their house stood right here where this small apartment building is. And exactly when they moved in, I have not yet figured it out, but Mrs. Marietta Lee was here, listed as a widow of Thomas Lee, who died in the 1880s. And she had many children, and I don't believe that this was actually a place where she moved with her husband, but I'm still trying to figure that out. But this was their property, and so that's where Lee Avenue got its name, from Mrs. Lee, whose house stood right here. Don't have a picture of it yet, but there may be one. It may not be listed as her house, but she was certainly here in the early directories of 1902 and right through to about 1918. And I suspect that this wall was surrounding her property. We have some beautiful houses on Lee Avenue, and I'm not able to go through every street in the neighborhood. That would take us all day, which we don't have. But I thought I would try to show some representative houses and just talk about why they're there, people who live there, and maybe a little bit about the house styles as well. So you might see one of your houses, or you might see one similar to yours as we continue. So let's head down this way. John here, who lives south of Oakley Avenue, was asking if there's a lot of difference between north and south of Oakley Avenue. There is to some extent, because the area south was officially subdivided and developed a little bit earlier than the area to the north. and the lots down there were a little bit bigger, so there was a dividing line along Oakley Avenue, which until the 1930s was still known as Pandora Avenue. Originally, Oakley Avenue started at the Oak Bay boundary. There were fancier houses along Oakley Avenue and the other side for sure. I came here in 1960. I was 11, and I lived in Fairfield at the time, but in those days we kind of roamed fairly far afield, so my first memory of actually coming to this neighborhood was in about 1961. I came with a friend who was a member of the, he called it Vic Lawn, and I couldn't imagine what he was talking about. I was not a tennis player, but his family were. And we came in here because this whole area where the Safeway is now, this block became the Victoria Lawn and Tennis Club. And it was a wonderful place, but the land was too valuable. The buildings were old. The club was established in the early 1900s, and so they decided to move way out in the country where the land was cheaper and they could have a bigger facility, and that was the early Racket Club, which is now part of the UVic sports facility on Gordon Head Road. But it started off here. So that's why you have new development in this corner where the Safeway is, because that was originally set aside for the Victoria Lawn and Tennis Club. Now, I have no idea who Berthier was. Sometimes it's obvious where you find a name on property lists, but I have tried in vain to find why Berthier Street is named that, but that may come to light at some point. But one of the interesting things I discovered, looking through the assessment rolls, which are in the City of Victoria archives, I discovered that from here over to Foul Bay Road, and roughly this whole area along here that includes Lee, Redfern, and Berthier and Leighton, was owned by a development company, Gessman and Pike. That's Gessman. And Mr. Gessman lived in Regina, and Mr. Pike lived in Iowa. And in the 1908 assessment rolls, they owned everything in this area except for Mrs. Lee's property, and I suspect that they had purchased part of the Lee farm. And they were the ones that were going to subdivide it, and the lots, can you believe this? Now, a corner lot is going to be more expensive, of course. A corner lot was $160, and in between the corners, $140. Yeah. So what? Multiply that by 20 or 30 these days, and you've got the price of a lot here, and pretty much the same all through town. But by 1908, there were no houses in this area over here. So that's why you'll find tracts of newer houses. And a street like Lee is really a perfect one. This could be a classic street for the pre-World War I Victoria building boom, because Victoria was booming. There had been booms and busts after gold rush days. The 1890s, early 1890s, were very stagnant here. It wasn't until the Klondike gold rush of 1898 that things started to pick up. And so the subdivisions had taken place in many areas, but the building didn't really start until later. And 1910, 1911, 1912, you find huge tracts of houses being built all through town, including down this street and some of the nearby streets. And they were typical houses built on spec, often by development companies, and the development companies would tend to follow a pattern, and so when you come down this street, you find many houses of similar design, and we're just going to stop at a few of them and talk about the style, and if I've been able to find out something about some of the people who lived there. So let's head this way. A question: why is there sort of a mishmash of building styles and ages on this side, and the other side seems to be a little bit more consistent? And a question that I asked as well, and I knocked on doors and tried to ask people if they knew something about the history of their houses, and some people do and some people don't. I think it was because the street on that side was developed earlier than the street here, but also there was a fire in the 1970s, and so it was replaced by this smaller house. In fact, it might have even been a house. People sometimes bought two lots for speculation purposes, and because there was a huge slump in 1912, just as these houses were being built, suddenly there was a big depression, and if you look in the early directories, you'll find that many of these houses were vacant. And vacant, not just for 1 or 2 years, but for a series of years, and the owners might have rented them out just to get somebody in them, but the rents were cheap. So I'm not sure who lived in this house, but as I look along the lists of people who lived here, there was somebody who was a checkout person at Drysdale's dry goods store, another man who was an auditor at the Foundation Company, which was a huge shipyard where Princess Mary Restaurant is now. Another man who was a cook for the Thai and Wheeler Cafe. Another man who was a machinist. Another man who was a carpenter. These were tradesmen and working men. These were not professional doctors, lawyers, and so on. These were people who earned their living in the trades primarily. And that's why you'll find that the houses are smaller, a little bit closer together, but the style is very, very interesting. Let's just walk a little bit farther along and we'll catch a look at one of the very typical California bungalows. The California bungalow style, or the bungalow style generally, bungalow was an Indian term, and bungalows usually had wide verandas because of the and broad roofs, big wide eaves, because it gets hot there, and of course there are the monsoons, and so you need to keep...
It's hot where?
In India. You need to keep the sun away, and you need to keep the monsoons away, which seems to be appropriate today. And so the bungalow style developed, usually a low-lying house. And in the early 1900s, the California bungalow developed in mostly Southern California, around Los Angeles, and it was a very simple house that could be built quickly and cheaply, but also it had some appealing lines. And these little houses here, and you'll see many of them, generally running front to back, the gable facing the street, and generally slightly asymmetrical, so the door is not in the middle, it's off to one side. And this is an interesting one. I've never seen one that has this sort of diaper pattern up above, one over there, and I'm not sure whether that's added later or not, the half-timbering effect that you might find on an English cottage. But the theme of a California bungalow is the use of textures and different building materials. So the texture you get from that diaper pattern up there is very, very typical. Also, the heavy columns on this one, and probably you see it better on that one, the heavy upright column holding up the porch, the brackets, lots of big visible brackets. You'll find them on virtually every house along this street. And the siding, simple wood. Sometimes on the fancier ones you'll find stone or brick, clinker brick. Here we find just shingle work with a porch leading up. This house here, 1739, has a wonderful front door, very typical of the arts and crafts movement in the early 1900s, when the emphasis was on handcrafted materials, beaten brass, exposed beams, stonework, wood textures, and although we don't see the stained glass here, on many of the houses in the neighborhood you'll find stained glass, or at least interesting textured windows, such as the one across the street. So, typical houses, big wide eaves, overhanging eaves, such as the one that we see down there, running front to back, simple to build, and cheap, most importantly, to buy. I don't know exactly how much these houses would have cost when they were new, but we're looking at a few $1,000s. After the slump of 1912, house prices did not increase for another 50 years. If you can look at the assessed value of most of these houses in 1912, it was the assessed value in 1950. And then things started to go up slowly and then by leaps and bounds. So let's continue down this way. Do you know what year it was? 1912. Okay. This lady says that her house was built in 1912, and until she bought it, it was owned by the original family. Yeah, that's interesting. We were just admiring your front door. It's marvelous. Yeah, it's nice. I look for houses that are typical, but I also look for houses that are a little bit different. This one is so classic. Wide porch, exposed beam ends, the heavy square timbers, the double cut shingles, all the texture is here, and it's in remarkably good condition as well. So the lady who lived here couldn't really give me much information about the place. She's only lived here recently, but this is a house that I would like to find out a little bit more about. But very unusual in some ways in the city. People ask about the building boom. Why were people building so many houses? Well, why are people buying condominiums in Victoria today? I don't know.
Build it and they will come.
Build it and they will come. And that was very much part of it. And of course they didn't come because there was a big slump. And there was overbuilding. So let's hope that doesn't happen right now. And the big slump was worldwide. In 1912, there was a huge depression, and followed by World War I. And then the 1920s were prosperous, but not that prosperous in Victoria. And then the 1930s, of course, were wipeout everywhere. So that's why a lot of neighborhoods did not develop very quickly. Now, we can't see it because of the tree across the street, but let's go and have a look at that house directly across from us, the yellow one. Now, one of the very interesting building styles in British Columbia was the prefab house, or prefab office building. And one of the primary suppliers of these prefab buildings was the BC Mills Timber and Trading Company, where the Hastings Mill was in Vancouver. And in the east end of Vancouver and other places, you'll find rows and rows of little prefab houses. The bank that stood at the corner, well, still stands at the corner of what is now Douglas Street and Bay Street, right next to the Tasty Freeze, or the Dairy Queen, was a prefab bank from the BC Mills Timber and Trading Company. You'll find banks like that right across the west, on the prairies and in BC. But I believe this is probably a BC Mills Timber and Trading Company building. We may never know for sure, but the reason I suspect this is because if you look at all the other houses, they have siding and shingles that are running horizontally. But look at this one. It's got vertical members. And if you look down the side, each side, you'll find the same sorts of things. And that's exactly what the signature is for the BC Mills Timber and Trading buildings, because they came in sections. You literally bought them in a crate, and you put it together very, very quickly. You could put together a house like this probably in a matter of a weekend or a couple of days, because you just put up the frame, all the pieces went up, and those vertical bars went across to hide the joins. So you didn't have to have a carpenter on site on a day like today hammering it together. Most of it came ready-made. And it's the only one I've seen like this in the area, but I suspect, unless the owner has put those on for some reason that we don't know, I suspect this is a BC Mills Timber and Trading Company building. Well, a question along the way. Somebody's just moved to the area and wonders why the numbering system has such high numbers. For streets that might only have 50 houses on, why do you have numbers up in the thousands? And certainly, depending on where you come from, it's a logical question, but it stems from the fact that in 1907 to 1908, the city of Victoria changed the street numbering system, actually changed the names of some of the streets, and then changed the numbering system to be totally consistent from one end of the city to the other, with the blocks being laid out as units, tens, 20s, 30s, and so on, hundreds, thousands, and they start downtown and run this way. They start at the waterfront along Dallas Road and run this way. So the north-south streets and the east-west streets all have same block numbers. So if you were to run in a swath right through this way, through town, you would find that we all have the 1700 block or the 1900 block or whatever all the way through. So it's an easy way. If you say to somebody, I live on the 1900 block of whatever, you kind of get a rough idea where they would be. Whereas in some cities where I have lived, this would be house number 1, not 1901. So that's why we have it that way. Now, I said I knew what Lee Street was named after. I wasn't sure about Berthier, but Layton is another one of those mysteries, and couldn't find any Layton landowners here. Looked in the city directories and found one Layton living in the area, but it didn't seem likely that they would have had the street named after them. So I'm just assuming, and this is again a theory, that it was probably named after Frederick Layton, the artist, because we have some other literary allusions across the way, Byron and Milton and so on, and it's quite possible that they were just using literary allusions and artistic allusions for Layton, but who knows. But that's what we'll go on for now. So let's walk down Redfern, and I think some of you live on Redfern. I do know who that is named after. The street itself originally had a different name. It was Hulton, but it was named, and I have no idea who Hulton was, but it was named after our mayor of Victoria, Charles Redfern. He was mayor twice, in the early 1880s and then in the late 1890s. And he was born in London, came here, and he had the good fortune to arrive on the ship Tynemouth. The Tynemouth was the bride ship. So he was one of the few men on the bride ship. Mind you, the women were kept completely sequestered from the men. And he started a jewelry store downtown, and is the one who supplied the clock in Victoria City Hall Tower. He didn't live here, though, and I don't believe he owned property here. Sometimes that's a clue if you find an early property owner. His house was down by Laurel Point Inn. But nonetheless, during his term as mayor, this area was probably being opened up, and so they named a street after him, Redfern. And another lady tells us she lives across the street, a house built in 1912, which is not surprising. But look at the house to the left of it as well. Stone foundations. And it looks like the stonework up above, I'm not sure if that's old or new, but the stonework below is definitely old, and we'll see some of that when we get onto Fell. This one was here a little bit earlier. This is not built as a house. It's certainly serving as a house now. It was built as a church. Built in 1892, when this was Halton Street, and it was built as the East Fernwood Mission Presbyterian, from St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. This area was originally known, I had some difficulty when I was looking in the assessment rolls because, well, we call it South Jubilee today, but it wasn't called that. It was called East Fernwood. And so if you know it's called East Fernwood, it's easy to figure out. And so this was the East Fernwood Mission, and there weren't a lot of people living right around here in 1892, but there were some. And it was probably just a little bit too far to go to get downtown to go to church. It became St. Columba's Presbyterian, and at one time there was a church on Oak Bay Avenue, just a little bit down that way. Again, divisions caused things to break away. This building was designed by a fairly well-known architect named Maxwell Muir, and his own house, we'll see later in the tour. It used to be on Oak Bay Avenue. It's now on Bank Street. But he designed this, I presume, as a freebie or at a very low rate. And Maxwell Muir designed many buildings. The Board of Trade building in Bastion Square is probably one of the best-known buildings. He built actually in the same year as this, 1892. This was the precursor to the Oak Bay United Church on Granite. It was built in 1913. The congregation moved from here to there. And I'm not exactly sure the sequence of uses here, but later it was used as a Masonic hall, and later it was used by Boy Scouts, and who knows, perhaps some of you know some of the other uses that it might have been put to. Now, obviously, it's a residence. But St. Columba's, originally the East Fernwood Mission. This house, I find there's a wonderful list on the City of Victoria Archives website. In the early days, quite often, people did not have addresses at all. It was just a house name. The city directory actually gave a listing of the house name, the owner's name, and the street address, if there was one. And one that popped out on Halton was this house here. And I'd already noticed the house as rather intriguing because of the roof. Anyway, the name of this house was Iona Cottage. And Iona, linked with St. Columba, the island of Iona. Who knows? Maybe this was the manse for the church. I doubt it, but maybe there was some link. So rather interesting nonetheless. Now, and the house next door, again, a typical arts and crafts style, very heavy timbers, the very rough brick chimney that you see, those are clinker bricks, and typically the brickyards, like the ones where Mayfair Mall is now, would have thrown those out. It shows a very poor burn. They were not much good except for landfill. However, in the early 1900s, when people were interested more in textures and things, the architects discovered these wonderful bricks that were all glassy and dark and crinkly, and suddenly all the brickyards cleaned out all their culls and began making these things deliberately. So you can look at the chimney, it's all rough and battered. It was done purposely to show the different textures and colors. Very typical of an arts and crafts style house. Now let's walk down to the corner next. We'll not go to the corner, we'll stop here because I was intrigued by this and don't know anything about it, and it may well be that it's a new construction, but I suspect that this little corrugated shed has been here for a while. It's a history of little buildings like this, the back buildings, that sometimes are just as intriguing as the buildings that we see up front. Since it's noisy down there, we'll actually talk about Oak Bay Avenue from here. And I mentioned earlier that Oak Bay Avenue, until at least the 1930s, was known as Pandora Avenue, up to the Oak Bay border. And this property had been purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company from the native people in 1850 under treaty. James Douglas, chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, had been told to make treaties with the native people, and he did for the greater Victoria area. A little bit in Nanaimo, up by Port Hardy, and apart from that, there were no treaties made at all on Vancouver Island. They did this because they knew they wanted to settle here. Joseph Despard Pemberton came in as the Surveyor General, and he subdivided the land, created the plans, and then the property was put on the market by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1851. And James Douglas bought a huge tract, which is now South Fairfield. Joseph Despard Pemberton, who knew the land well, was second in line, and he purchased basically what is all of the eastern end of Rockland, from about Government House all the way where we are now. The whole property that we're walking on now will be his property all the way through to the Victoria Golf Course on Beach Drive. Not a bad purchase. The reason he bought it was because when he was doing the surveying, there was a large lake which attracted his attention. The lake was down where Pemberton Park is now, the area around St. Matthias Church, Richmond and Richardson. Huge swampy lake in the winter. On a day like today, it would start to fill up and it would remain full all winter and then drain away in the summer, and they would graze cattle on it. Well, he saw a native man hunting a deer when he was surveying and decided that was the spot for him. So he bought the land all around it and built his own house on the ridge just up behind, near the corner of St. Charles and Rockland Avenue. Now the house is gone. Anyway, this was his, all of this. And he subdivided bits and pieces of it early on. He subdivided the area south of Oak Bay Avenue in the 1880s. So when somebody was asking earlier about that, it was subdivided earlier on by Pemberton directly. The streetcar went through in 1890, running right along, or 1891, from Oak Bay Junction, where the streetcar turned off the Mount Ptolemy line and headed down Oak Bay Avenue, ending up at Windsor Park, which was a pleasure ground. The Electric Railway Company had lots of businessmen going to work in the weekdays, but there was no traffic on the weekend, and so they had a pleasure ground there where Windsor Park is today. 1893, Joseph Despard Pemberton was riding on his horse with his wife. His wife was a little bit younger than he was, and she raced ahead, galloping along Oak Bay Avenue, and he lingered behind and dropped dead, fell off his horse, and so she went back and picked him up, and that was the end of him. But this was all his property, and he had several children, and one of the daughters eventually married Mr. Holmes, and the Pemberton Holmes Real Estate Company is a result, and they got their start because they owned half the city. But Oak Bay Avenue was laid out right through the middle of Pemberton's property to get people through. He was a big booster of the land company that was starting to develop the area in what is now the municipality of Oak Bay. So, again, streetcars right here in 1891. This is one of the best served areas, and that's why so many of these places were built. These were people who generally would not have owned a car, even when cars had been invented. The streetcar was the only way to get into town if they needed to. Okay, let's now go down this way and we'll turn to our right. Now, my apologies to anyone who lives on Davy Street. We won't be going up Davy. Named after Theodore Davy, who was one of the premiers of British Columbia, later the Supreme Court Justice. Davy Street in Vancouver is also named after him. And mentioned about pear orchards. Now, I think, were you telling me yesterday about orchards behind your house? Okay. A story that there might have been orchards here, possibly pear orchards along here. Those sorts of details are sometimes difficult to track down because they wouldn't show up on maps or even in city directories. But still, if there's a rumor about orchards, the chances are there were. So, it was a dairy farm? Okay, and do you know where the farmhouse was?
Yeah, in the big house. It's a large house.
Okay, on Davy Street?
Yeah.
Okay, so the old house on Davy Street, farmhouse, okay, and cows coming down. That would probably explain why there are so many newer houses on this street if this is being used for grazing cattle. Okay, I can't tell you about this church. Maybe somebody can, but I don't know when that building was built, although it does look as though it's been there for a while. But I can tell you about the house that stands on the other side of the street, so let's stop there briefly, and then we're going to be heading up south. The house across the way was one that attracted my attention when I was in the city archives looking through the photographs of this neighborhood, and that one actually had a name, 1863 Oak Bay Avenue. The house name was Nittinat, and many of you probably know that Nittinat Lake goes down to the West Coast Trail, and it's not surprising that the man who lived here, I don't think he was the one that the house was built for. The house was built about 1903, but the man who was living here in 1908, who made additions to it, was Edward Hardwick, who was a timber cruiser. So the chances are he'd worked the West Coast, and the Nittinat area was well known to him. But the house was actually designed by a well-known architectural firm, Hooper and Watkins. And you can generally tell a Tom Hooper building because it has those rounded edges to it that you see on that upper balcony. Right now, let's go up this way and up Fell. Fell Street, named after Mayor Fell, James Fell. He was mayor in 1885 to 1887. He ran a grocery store, Fort Street and Broad Street, just across from the Bay Centre. He was a grocer. He was also a spiritualist and was president of the local spiritualist society for many, many years. He was also a proponent of free love. And so he was quite a character in his day, but he weighed about 300 pounds. And so, and it was during his term as mayor that the Royal Jubilee Hospital new building was approved. But he didn't have anything to do with this property. They simply named the street after him because of his association with the city. So that's how Fell Street got its name. Now, this street is a rather intriguing one, partly because of the stone. And we talked about the stone when we were over on Redfern, and I said I would mention it here. Across the street you have several very elegant stone walls, and you have a stone wall here, and you have a stone wall and stone facing on this house, just facing. It's not built of stone, it's just a facing on the house. And the people who live here have just recently moved in, but they told me that their house was built by the person who had the house next door. And this is your house. Oh, that's your house. Okay, great. And now, do you know the year of the house? 1908 and 1912. Okay. Okay, and I suspect actually the same builder was doing a lot of work. It might have been a builder for a whole street. It might have been a builder for a couple of lots. But there's so many similar styles. I'm imagining that the same builder worked a lot in this area. The way to find out, by the way, is to go to the City of Victoria archives and look at the assessment rolls, which are on microfilm. And if you know your legal description, it's useful to know, because you then go to the book. And if you think the house was built in about 1912, then go to 1912 and look up the lot. And you'll soon discover, because when you get your assessment notice, it lists land, which is the huge amount, and the house, which is worth virtually nothing. And, of course, in the old days, when there was no house on it, it was just land. So say $1,000. And improvements, zero, 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 and then all of a sudden, boom, in 1 year, $2,000, or whatever it might be. You know that that's the year your house was built because they started to assess it at that time. The stonework here is what intrigued me, and as I mentioned earlier, I live in James Bay, and there was an old fellow who died in about 1985 who told me when he was a lad how the stone was cut. And it was done the same through the city. These were glacial erratics, generally, big boulders that were dropped here by the glaciers 10,000 or so years ago when the glaciers were melting. And in order to do this, it was very laborious. You would hand drill into the stone, and you would create a row of holes. And then you would put a little tiny bit of calcium carbide in the bottom of each one, a little bit of water, and you would very quickly put a bung, like a big cork, in the top of each hole, and the resulting pressure would split the stone down that row. And then once you'd split the stone, you'd do it all over again. Another row, split again, and you can imagine how many hours were taken to get stones of this size from a big glacial erratic. But that's how most of the stonework was done. And this was obviously done by somebody who knew what he was doing, because the joins and so on are done very, very nicely. Okay, let's continue now up to the corner this way. The Fell Street Confectionery. Does anyone remember it? Was it this building here? Could have been. No, it was definitely the corner of Leighton, according to the city directories, and from 1932 at least. And so, because this one is right next to the road, I'm assuming this was it, but still, we have to check that one out. Now, this apartment building, did you know you had a fire hall in the neighborhood? I'm sure you did. Okay. It closed in 1937, and this one originally served Oak Bay, but the people in Oak Bay got fed up paying Victoria for their fire service, and so this one closed in 1937, and this area was served from the main fire hall, just near where Central Middle School is today. I don't know exactly when it was built, but it was certainly here in the early 1900s. It was Fire Hall number 8, and it was a double one on Duchess, just at the other side of the apartment building facing that way. There's a wonderful picture in a book called First Water Tigers. It's the only picture I've seen of the fire hall, Some of you might have seen that book, but it shows the fire hall with the front doors open and 2 fire trucks ready to head out. Does anyone know, did they tear it down or did they build the apartment building around it? I had heard that the fire hall had been incorporated into the apartment building, but...
certainly in the apartments, this is where we live. It's not purpose-built for apartments.
Yeah, there are, especially because we're on the top floor, and there's interesting curvature to some of the walls as they come into the public structure.
Okay. Yeah. And is there a pole coming down from the top? Okay, so it's quite possible then that the fire hall was incorporated into the apartment building if it's like that. So the corner stores, the fire hall, definitely something to check out. We're not going to be walking up Duchess. I don't know why it's called Duchess, but that block of Davie used to be called Baronet. So we had Baronet and Duchess, and of course farther down into town we had Empress and so on, Princess. Again, this is only a guess that in 1901 the Duke and Duchess of York came to town. And they stayed, the government house had burned down, so they stayed at what was the Mount Baker Hotel on Beach Drive near the Oak Bay Marina. It's gone now. They named a lot of things after royalty in those days, so it might have been a bit of flattery, the Duchess of York, who knows. But it would be just around the time when this street was being opened up. Anyway, let's go this way. There was a cement block factory that churned out these sorts of cement blocks where Vic High is now. And they did that because the site of Vic High was a gravel pit. And when the school was built in 1914, the neighbors there were quite happy because the gravel pit had filled with water and was considered quite dangerous. But the cement block factory, I suspect, was the one that supplied these, but there's no record for sure. But the one question I have as well is, why is there a vacant lot next door? Does anyone know? Was there a house there? Was it always a vacant lot?
Always.
Always. Okay, so...
Who owns it?
The Sappy. Okay.
We've been in negotiations with him, but he bought the property for $600 25 years ago from the city. And now, of course, he's tried a 4-lot subdivision on us.
Of course, yes. Okay, so the rumor is he bought it for $600 from the city not long ago and now wants a 4-lot subdivision. Okay, be vigilant. Don't let him do it. Yeah.
Isn't it bound by something to do with the oak trees outside, right? Yeah, there's a move to make it some kind of park and karaoke preservation situation.
Well, these days, of course, the city has done something to protect the karaoke trees, so it would have been difficult now to take them down without city approval. Okay, now let's go and stand next in front of the school on Bank Street. Okay, so the Bank Street School, which is another defining element in the neighborhood. The Bank Street School was built in 1910-11, which was during a time of rapid expansion. So the neighborhood was growing, and there were lots of schools being built around the same time. So Sir James Douglas School, Margaret Jenkins School, and so on were all being built around the same time. The new Victoria High School, where Central Middle School is now, was built on Fernwood Road, opening in 1903. So there was a huge boom in school construction in the early 1900s. This one was sort of the end of the era because the collapse came and then World War I, and people weren't building anything for a while after that. But it's a wonderful school, really, in terms of the slate roof, the detailing around the front. If you look up by the eaves, you'll see down the 2 pilasters and brick coming down the front. Art Nouveau, stylizing, lots of swirls and things like that, which is a little bit more embellishment than you would expect on most schools from that time. And the architect was well known. His name was David Frame. He was born in England. Came out here, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but he was certainly practicing here in the early 1900s and was well known. The other school that he built, which is famous, was the Chinese Public School. And there were no Chinese architects allowed to practice in Victoria at the time. That was only in 1947, so they hired him to design the Chinese Public School, but obviously different design on this one. The bell-cast eaves, the roof that comes down and then flares out, is the style known as bell-cast, and it was a style that was very popular with Samuel McClure, one of the well-known architects at the time as well. And you'll see bell-cast actually on the roof over there, that little white stucco cottage with the 2 brick chimneys. The roof comes down and then flares out. Really popular in the very early 1900s. So, Bank Street School, a very interesting place. Now, what I'd like to do is to walk almost down to the corner and point out a rather interesting house. So, if you'd like to, please follow me. Pictures from the Victoria City Archives, just a Xerox. The top left is this house right here. And the top right is a streetcar heading along Oak Bay Avenue, just here near the bottom of Bank Street. Okay, the house here, 1511 Bank Street, according to the photograph, had a name. This is one of the ones on the list of names. It was called Brem Hill, and it was the residence for Maxwell Muir, the architect who designed the church, the architect who designed the Board of Trade building, and also many other fine buildings. He was Scottish and was a well-known architect here in Victoria. The house was moved to this site in 1947. The house had originally stood around the corner on Oak Bay Avenue. I'm not sure if the people who live there know that or not. I was quite surprised when I came across that photograph in the city archives, and then I thought, I've got to come, and so sure enough, there it is. There's no doubt. Stuccoed over, of course, and they added some lions to make it look interesting, but that's the old house. I think quite often when people live in a house that was designed by a famous architect or live in a house that was lived in by a famous person, that's sort of added interest. But I think one of the charms of this neighborhood is that there aren't a lot of those sorts of places, and that the houses nonetheless are really interesting just because of what they are. And not because of any particular individual who lived there or designed them, but because they represent a really interesting era in the development of Victoria. So this sort of place will add a bit of interest, but it's not necessarily the be-all and the end-all. But in some neighborhoods, people would look only for houses designed by famous people. But I think here you've got some fine, and it's amazing in what good condition a lot of these places are in. This was Bunny's Beanery. Yes, she called it Bunny's Beanery.
This was Bunny's Beanery, and there were 15 or 16 of us, men and women, who lived there. It was a fun place to be. The food was pretty good, and we really enjoyed it. And I was there about a year, I guess. Got engaged while I was there.
How old would you be?
This is the man that gave you a lift downtown.
I was 24.
15 or 16 young people live there?
Yeah, and one older, and of course the owners, and one older couple who lived in the basement.
And who was Bunny?
Bunny, Mrs. Baker.
Mrs. Baker, okay.
Yeah. And they had a daughter, Maggie, and it was a fun place to be.
Okay, let's go back up to Leighton this way. And just a couple of other comments that help define the area. Of course, when people were going for coffee, if they could, they'd probably go up to Ian's. Up here, who knows, maybe it'll get going again. Down at the corner of Richmond and Oak Bay Avenue was one of the very first buildings for University School. It got going in the early 1900s, and we won't be going quite as far, partly because it's wet, but also we're running out of time. But along Leighton, we'll come to Richmond and then Jubilee, and then the next street along is Belcher. And it's kind of an unfortunate name, but Belcher was originally the name of what is now Rockland Avenue. And Belcher was the name of an Arctic explorer, along with Sir John Franklin and many others. And in the 1860s, they named a lot of streets after Sir John Franklin and some of his cronies. When Lady Franklin came to town, it was a bit of flattery for her. However, Rockland became a very fashionable neighborhood, and the name Belcher definitely is not very, very flattering, and so they changed the name to Rockland after one of the big houses along the street. But I don't know why. They left a little remnant of Belcher, and that's the part in this neighborhood. And University School, as it grew up near Mount Tommy, was actually the amalgamation of the senior boys' school, which Mr. Barnacle ran down here at the corner. There's an apartment building there now, old wooden apartment building, and the Reverend William Bolton, who had married into the Douglas family, had the junior boys' school on Belcher. The building is gone now, but they amalgamated in 1908 and moved up to where University School is now. Now, there was a gentleman that was talking about the big house that used to be here. I do know that when we're thinking of manor houses, we have to go just a little bit beyond here. If we go right to the end of Leighton and cross Fort Street, That's the site of where St. Margaret's School used to be. And that property and all the property over to where Belmont Avenue is, St. Barnabas Church, from Fort Street practically right through to Bay Street was the estate of Benjamin Pierce. He was the Assistant Surveyor General, and his huge house stood where Fernwood Manor Apartments are on Begbie Street. And that was a manor house in the old sense, and he called his estate Fernwood, and the Fernwood neighborhood derives its name from that. But that's probably all I have to say until we get to Christie's Carriage House, and so follow me if you wish. In places like England, the neighborhood pubs help define the neighborhoods. Not so much here in Canada, and neighborhood pubs are a newfangled thing anyway, but this one probably is one of the buildings that does help define part of the neighborhood at least. And it was a house built in 1901 for Eldridge Christie. He was a carriage builder, and so he didn't build the carriages here. He built them downtown, but they called it Christie's Carriage House because he was a carriage builder. The house was built in 1901, and the original part of the house was in this Queen Anne style, turrets, wraparound porches, asymmetrical, very, very popular in the 1890s and early 1900s. And the house had a name. It was called Sandalphon, Sandalphon. Most people probably wouldn't have known it as that. And the family owned it until 1948, and then it became apartments. And then 40 years later, in 1986, it became the pub. So it's been a wet day, as you know, all too well. We've lost a few along the way, so thank you for persevering. And I'm going to pop inside, I think, for at least something warm. So, okay.